Welcome to our lecture on fascism, in which we'll examine another ideology growing up out of the dislocations and traumas of the First World War. In our previous lecture, we had considered the growth of Soviet civilization and the communist ideology, in part also a radical outgrowth of the First World War as total war. In today's lecture, we'll examine an ideology that presented itself quite consciously as an alternative, as a future in opposition to that offered by communist ideology, fascism. It rejected parliamentary democracy and liberalism, as well as socialism and communism, and claimed to be the wave of the future. In discussing fascism, we need first of all to engage in the often difficult business of even defining the phenomenon itself. We should start by mentioning that fascism originated in a particular time and place. It was a reaction to the destabilizing influence of World War I and the damage that total war wrought on the certainties and the order, the ideas of the 19th century. Today, however, the term fascism is used very broadly to designate authoritarian regimes as such, often simply as a generalized term of abuse. What we need to do is to be a little more specific, to see how this term and its meaning grew out of one time and place, post-war Italy. Fascist ideas would certainly acquire wide influence. They would be spread and imitated in many other countries, but they would rarely become as dominant as they did in Italy. The German Nazis would draw inspiration from Italian fascism. Historians continue to debate today about the relationship of Nazism and fascism. Clearly they're linked, but historians still debate whether Nazi Germany should be understood as a sub-variety of a larger species known as fascism, or whether Nazism, for all of its linkages with the original fascism, represents something so very different and distinctively German that it should be considered a phenomenon entirely unto itself. It's a topic we'll return to. Italian fascism originally lacked some elements that played a very important role in Nazism, such as the explicit racism and anti-Semitism of the Nazis, but it would later adopt these under Hitler's influence. So these were ideologies that were able to adapt and change. Though fascist ideology in Italy was often inchoate, since it despised rational thought as enervating and not genuine and not vital, it often had an antipathy to being systematic. It did have some general ideas that it stood for. Fascism opposed socialism and communism, hated parliamentary government and democracy and liberal ideas as weak and things of the past, and instead championed certain ideas that it felt the First World War had brought to the fore. It championed order, the power of a great centralized state over individuals, not serving them, not individuals there to be served by the state, but individuals to serve the state, and also celebrated an ethos of brutal heroism to be realized through dynamic revolution and violence. Fascism would be identified with the man who brought it to the fore in Italy, Benito Mussolini. We'd like to consider the origins of this self-made dictator. His origins, similarly to those of Stalin's, were not necessarily auspicious. Mussolini was born in 1883 in a poor village in the Romana region of Italy, to a poor family. His father was a blacksmith, a committed socialist through and through, who hoped for a great career for his son. He named him after a famous Mexican revolutionary, a personal hero of his, Benito Juarez. But this socialist father could little expect the directions in which his son would later go. Like Stalin, Mussolini's school years were disordered. He was expelled from school not once, but twice for stabbing a classmate. Like Stalin, like Hitler, like Saddam Hussein and Pol Pot, dictators we'll be discussing later in our lectures, Mussolini had in common with them a childhood marked by spotty education as well as what one might call with understatement, discipline problems. But Mussolini was different from his other colleagues, whom we'll be discussing later, in that he did return to finish his education. But upon concluding school, he lived a rather bohemian life, unsure of direction professionally and personally, and spent time working in Switzerland. In a remarkable coincidence, this was exactly where Lenin was at the time, a remarkable communist revolutionary in exile. Mussolini later claimed to have met Lenin in exile and to have discussed with him. One would find it fascinating to have been a fly on the wall in those conversations, if they indeed did take place. Many historians doubt whether this claim had any truth to it at all, but it's certainly a remarkable suggestion. Upon returning to Italy before the First World War, Mussolini now entered into a more serious career. He worked as a school teacher and began a political life as well, entering energetically into socialist politics, where he began to make a name for himself. He edited socialist journals, including the premier socialist newspaper in Italy, Avanti, Forward, and also, remarkably enough, in the context of our course, a socialist journal actually called Utopia, making clear the connection between ideologies and these imagined futures. What already marked Mussolini in this vigorous start in his socialist career was a characteristic belief that in some ways set him apart from some followers of socialism, that violence and clashes were key to the historical process and indeed were what turned the wheels of history. This emphasis on violence would become even more accentuated in the years to come. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Italy was on the sidelines until 1915, when it was coaxed onto the Allied side to fight against its former allies of Germany and Austria-Hungary. After some initial hesitation about how to react to these world historical events, Mussolini broke with his other more moderate socialist comrades who condemned the war, at least for now. He argued, by contrast, that Italy should intervene, not out of support for a capitalist war, but rather because violence could move progress forward. Much as Lenin was claiming at the same time, Mussolini as a socialist was convinced that the war could be an opportunity for revolution and change. Mussolini was unpopular in this stance among other socialists who had not followed him through on this development in Italy. He was stripped of his editorship of socialist periodicals and was actually expelled from the Socialist Party. He began to change. Mussolini now struck off in his own political direction by advocating energetically Italian entry into the war. As now is clear from documentation, Mussolini was actually subsidized by the French government, which funneled him money, hoping that his efforts and those of others in a similar position in Italy could bring Italy in on the side of the Allies. Much as Lenin was willing to use German support for his aims, so too Mussolini showed a remarkable flexibility in his political choices. Mussolini fought in the First World War and apparently acquitted himself in a distinguished way. After Italy had entered the war in 1915, Mussolini had called for this war. The futurist artists who had praised violence as a hygiene for mankind had wanted war. But the results of this conflict were not those that they had hoped for. The conflict went badly for Italy. Its war effort bogged down, and Italy lost 500,000 dead. As we've seen in our earlier lectures, as in the case of other countries, stormtroopers, certain elite troops, were created to break through the stalemate of the fighting on the trenches or of the Alpine campaigns in the case of Italy. In the Italian context, these stormtroopers, called arditi, or the bold ones, the fearless ones, were hailed as national heroes, and maybe even as a new breed of human being. Victory would come as a disappointment for the Italians, and that disappointment would have consequences. I think we're prone, given the historical record, to think that it's defeat above all that unleashes crisis in a defeated country. We think of the role that defeat in the First World War would have in ushering in the Nazi movement in Germany. Paradoxically, victory could also have such effects as in the case of Italy. At the Versailles negotiations, Italy felt that it was cheated. Though it was officially on the side of the victors, Italy was denied the territorial gains that had been promised by the sometimes cynical diplomacy of the Western Allies, and thus, as Italians left the negotiations, their nationalists denounced what they called the mutilated peace of Versailles. The sacrifices of so many lives, it seemed, might have been for naught. And thus the aftermath of the war would bring post-war turmoil for Italy. This turmoil included workers' strikes, rural unrest, unstable governments, and the growth of a communist movement as well that alarmed the established elites. The organization of veteran paramilitary groups resembling the Freikorps in Germany now took to the streets in order to do battle in a virtual civil war resembling that of Germany. At the same time, there was a certain drama to this street theater of violence, one which created an aura around conflict and the notion that direct results could be achieved by direct action. In 1919, a particular media event took place which would further accentuate and underline this mystique. The Romantic poet Gabriele D'Annunzio led a raid that captured the contested port of Trieste, which Italy had demanded in protest at the outcome of the war. What this seemed to indicate was that direct action could produce results, and Mussolini was envious of D'Annunzio and resolved to take direct action himself. This is a recurring point we'll see in our lectures, that the leaders and the dictators, the despots we describe in our lectures, were often not acting in a vacuum, but rather had particular models, whether more remote in time or close in time, that they were following. Mussolini would now seek to stage manage a myth of his own. That myth, involving the stage-managed, orchestrated movement of masses of people, another recurring theme, was to be the March on Rome, which would in turn be imitated by dictators or would-be dictators like Hitler in the years to come. Mussolini sought to use the post-war turmoil in Italy as the staging ground for his new political movement, which would fuse nationalism, which had been revealed as such a potent force in the First World War, with some revolutionary ideas and some relics of his socialist career. The fascist movement presented itself as a safeguard above all against communist revolution, and thus could win adherents from the more conservative middle classes or the aristocracy and other established elites. In spite of this trumpeted announcement of opposition to the communist model of the future, however, in person, Mussolini was a little bit more ambivalent. He could on occasion express his clear admiration for the communists and what they had achieved in terms of new politics. Mussolini in particular expressed his admiration for Vladimir Ilyich Lenin of the Soviet Union as a man who he said was an artist who used human beings as his material in forming a new world, clearly something he wanted to emulate. We will see how precisely such publicly announced opposition of one ideological movement for another in the 20th century could benefit both sides, producing perversely a kind of linkage between ideological mortal enemies who gained in dynamism by claiming to oppose another ideological movement. The analyst of crowds and crowd psychology, whom we'd mentioned in our very first lecture, Elias Canetti, had pointed out that any crowd could gain energy by opposing another crowd and vice versa, leading to a complicated dialectical process in which one crowd fed off the other for its dynamism. Mussolini had a potent symbol for the dynamism of his movement, the black-shirted squads, the fascists. The fascist movement began in March 1919 in Milan officially. It took its name from the particular combat squads which Mussolini had gathered, known as the Fasci di Combattimento. The word fascio in Italian means a league or a unit, a group, but it also has a more ancient meaning. It was also the name of the ancient Roman imperial symbol for the unity of the state, a bundle of sticks tied around an axe. The notion was that any sole individual or stick could easily be broken, but a bundle of sticks tied together were unbreakable. In unity would be strength. These violent fascist squads, often made up of former Arditi veterans, the stormtroopers of the First World War, adopted the stormtroopers' anthem from the trenches. That anthem was Giovinezza, or youth. They adopted the nihilistic slogan of the stormtroopers, I don't give a damn. They also adopted black shirts as their uniforms and the classical Roman salute of the outstretched right arm as a badge of their belonging. The gang leaders, the mobsters who ran these units of thugs, were called by the title of Ras, after Ethiopian chieftains, reflecting the imperialist heritage of Italian imperialist experience. In the streets of Italian cities, these fascist squads of black shirts brutalized and murdered political opponents and broke up strikes, claiming that they were restoring order. This was a sign of great cynicism because in part they were creating the very disorder that they were claiming to be in the process of eliminating. They were marked by nihilism, they loved violence, and those opponents whom they didn't kill outright immediately, whom they cornered in the streets or in the squares, they loved to humiliate by forcing them to drink gallons of castor oil. This was intended to be symbolically hilarious. Castor oil intended to purge the system, and this was a symbol for the cleansing of the body politic of Italy as well, would destroy the insides of the political opponents who were thus subjected to torture. Mussolini now felt that after having stirred up disorder, he was ready to begin the movement to seize power. The fascists now claimed, in the fall of 1922, that a communist takeover was in the offing, one that they aimed to preempt by taking action first. In October of 1922, fascist leaders organized their squads from the different cities and localities of Italy to march on Rome, and thus began the quite deliberately staged myth of the March on Rome. From all of the localities and cities, they were intended to converge upon the capital of the Italian kingdom, and they announced that if they weren't given power, they would take power by force. Mussolini was not among them. Mussolini waited behind the scenes to see whether the result would be a bloodbath of his own followers, if they'd be shot or suppressed by the established authorities. He waited to see how the events would play out. Mussolini received behind the scenes a message which made a mockery of this supposedly heroic myth on Rome. That message was an invitation by the king to indeed form a government. While the fascist squads continued to march on Rome, Mussolini understood that he already had achieved power by means short of revolutionary violence. But nonetheless, the political theater of the march was allowed to play itself out and was turned into what was afterwards celebrated as a myth of direct action. Once in power, Mussolini set about consolidating his power in stages. He'd been invited to form the government. He was not yet in the position of a total regime, in spite of all of the rhetoric which Mussolini bombastically announced of the total power of the fascists. But consolidating his power by slow stages, Mussolini by 1929, about the same time that Stalin has consolidated his power, was in the position of a strong dictator. These stages were careful. Once he became prime minister, Mussolini made the black shirt squads themselves a government body, a militia essentially. Some of these black-shirted thugs, in fact, forced Mussolini's pace. In 1924, some of his bully boys killed a socialist by the name of Giacomo Matteotti. This shook the regime. It was a crisis. But Mussolini, in a dramatic moment, accepted responsibility for what had been done and now moved towards a firming up and consolidation of his dictatorship. In 1926, having weathered this crisis, the Ovra secret police were formed, Italian elections were suspended, and government by decree followed. In 1929, Mussolini pulled off a diplomatic masterstroke. He signed the Lateran treaties with the Vatican, which earlier had been alienated from Italian statehood, now guaranteeing that the Catholic Church had made its peace with this regime, at least for now. Though Mussolini described his regime as totalitarian, in fact, its control was far from total to begin with. We need now to turn to a closer examination of fascist ideology and style. What was fascism? What ideas did it stand for? Mussolini had once been asked, Signore Mussolini, what does fascism mean? And he had answered, me. Well, that wasn't a very useful answer for our purposes. We could dig a little deeper to understand the key notions of fascism, chief among them, action. Mussolini once summed up fascism itself in that one word. Vigorous action and violence were to be at the heart of the ideology. The Italian people, for so long robbed of united statehood, were to be remade through wars and the conquest of new empires. The slogan of the fascist movement was credere, obbedere, combattere. Believe, obey, and fight, the cardinal virtues. Fascism was also identified with the authority of the state and its personification, Il Duce, the leader, Mussolini himself. The state stood above individuals and expressed something larger than their aggregation. Larger than the sum of its parts, the state was to be a higher unity. And Mussolini, the leader, called Il Duce, by the way, always supposed to be rendered in capital letters in print, was to dominate the masses, who, somewhat chauvinistically in his macho attitudes, he considered to be feminine in nature and mastered by the force of his personality. The leader, Mussolini, was, in his very appearance, somewhat unlikely as a dominator of the masses. He was not very tall, in fact, just a little bit under average height at 5 foot 6 inches. But he would seek to accentuate his height by always speaking with his chin thrust upwards to make it appear that he was being viewed from a height. Mussolini's characteristic oratory and bombast seemed to produce results in the cheering of the crowds. The slogan, Mussolini is always right, seemed at such moments to achieve its vindication in the masses. The fascists, moreover, claimed to be inaugurating a New World era, and the March on Rome was designated the year zero of a new fascist calendar. We've already seen the establishment of new calendars, for instance, in the French Revolution of the 18th century. Nostalgias for the glories of ancient Rome permeated fascist propaganda in a cult of what was called Romanità, or a revival of the ancient Roman glories. Fascist monuments, huge and overbearing in style, resembling in uncanny ways those of the Soviet Union, mimicked Roman glories. At the same time, fascists promised progress, technological change, and the modernization of Italy. In one of their characteristic phrases, they claimed they would finally make the trains run on time. It's a testimony to the durability of such phrases that we sometimes hear even American politicians sometimes using this phrase without understanding that it doesn't have positive implications or its historical origins. Mussolini ordered public works projects on a gigantic scale, the building of the autostrada superhighways, the draining of the Pontine marshes, and the battle for grain to make Italy self-sufficient in food. Even free time was regimented by the regime, which claimed to be total in the Dopolavoro organization. The fascists also tried to regiment youth. They tried to project an image of their own youthfulness, breaking with the old and the traditional to produce a new man. Italian youth were inducted into organizations which wore black neckerchiefs, unlike the red neckerchiefs of the youth organizations of the Soviet Union. Their organizations were called the Balilla, or the Figli della Lupa, the Sons of the Wolf. Mass exercises, mass sports on the part of youth served both as propaganda and preparation for war. The fascists also claimed to have an entire new economic philosophy that transcended earlier class conflict and exploitation, which was called corporatism. This corporatism allegedly would set up corporate bodies representing workers, owners, and professionals, inducted into the government and forming a new corporate state without class conflict of economic harmony. These styles of rule, these potent symbols of the fascists, would be imitated worldwide in an illiberal wave, the rise of dictatorships. Worldwide, but especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and also in South America, dictatorships, as well as fascist movements or fascist-style movements, arose imitating Mussolini's image of a strong man in the fascist style. In spite of their borrowings, however, many of these regimes, probably most of them, remained more authoritarian and traditionally conservative in nature than being quite as purely fascist as the Italian fascist regime itself. But nonetheless, when one considers democracy and democratic states giving way to dictatorships in Central and Eastern Europe, the record is quite harrowing. After that initial burst of democratic enthusiasm after World War I, in the post-war period, dictatorships proliferated. They included dictatorships in Hungary, in Austria, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Latvia and Estonia, the Baltic states, in Bulgaria, in Portugal, in Spain, in Romania, in Venezuela, in Peru, in Bolivia, and Brazil. If the fascists claimed to be the wave of the future, they could point to this wave of dictatorships to back them up. In many countries, however, especially the Western democracies, whose state didn't always appear, especially in economic crisis, to be as stable as might otherwise be the case, fascist movements gained some popularity but remained largely on the fringes. The French Cross of Fire organization, or the British Union of British Fascists, led by Sir Oswald Mosley, certainly gained notoriety but little influence. The extent to which they copied the fascist model of Mussolini tended to make them appear out of place and very derivative, and it made them clearly the objects of derision. They could be poked fun at, as in the movie The Great Dictator of Charlie Chaplin. Other satire could also capture some of the ludicrous pretensions of these fascist-style movements and the extent to which they were imitations of Mussolini's original. One particular example that I'd like to share with you is that of the classic comic novels of the British writer P.G. Wodehouse. This master of the comic form included in his novels one recurring character, a buffoon, a would-be dictator of England by the name of Roderick Spode. This Roderick Spode, a clear imitator of Mussolini's model of the fascist seizure of power, aspired to bring together his own followers and to follow a March on Rome model within Great Britain. However, it was discovered that he was merely one of a whole wave of dictators who were so common in the time, Wodehouse argued, that by the time Roderick Spode got around to outfitting and uniforming his followers, all of the black shirts, all of the shirts of other colors had already been sold out at the department stores, and thus Spode's followers were reduced to buying black shorts. Their official name of this ludicrous collection, the Black Shorts, their official name was the Saviors of Britain, which had, as you'll notice, the unfortunate acronym of SOBs. The appeal of the model of fascist government, which had been poked fun at in such effective ways by Wodehouse and others, however, was not entirely a joke when one considers the extent to which it would have influence in a time of crisis in Europe. That appeal would grow stronger with the advent of the Great Depression in 1929, spelling the end of that brief era of greater stability from 1924 to 1929 that we mentioned in an earlier lecture. It seemed that the democracy was incapable in many cases, in the minds of many contemporaries, to deal with the challenges of economic freefall. By 1939, 3/5 of European countries were run by authoritarian governments. The democratic post-war wave had given way to a surging tide of dictatorships. The Italian fascists would also inspire the German Nazis, who would build a far stronger, in many ways more efficient, and more violent regime. The 1930s as a whole would appear as a time of a wave of dictatorships, fading democracy, and a dark decade indeed, which we'll examine in more detail in our next lecture.